So all eyes were on more Epstein revelations and the Supreme Court ruling on tariffs last week. But so much else has happened that you should know about that this is going to be a bit of a longer video. So this week, the Trump administration has targeted the environment, universities, health, other countries, and really leaned into its increasingly white nationalist agenda. But let's start with corruption and Trump as king. So Trump rewards those loyal to him. So last week he nominated a lawyer who was part of his legal team to serve as a judge on the 8th US Circuit Court of Appeals in Missouri. So that lawyer, Justin Smith, represented Trump in his case to the Supreme Court on presidential immunity and also in Trump's case against writer E. Jean Carroll, where a jury found that Trump was liable for sexually abusing and defaming her. And then there's kind of Trump, the would-be king. So over the last year, Trump's efforts to promote himself as kind of the dominant American have kind of become so commonplace that we're kind of glossing over them. So he regularly depicts himself in a heroic, almost godly fashion, often using kind of AI-generated imagery. He's depicted himself as a king, as a Superman, as a Jedi Knight, as a military hero, and even as a pope in a white cassock. He's basically been building this kind of cult of personality, the likes of which is really quite unprecedented in American history. And kind of in that vein, a large banner featuring Donald Trump's face was hung on the exterior of the Justice Department headquarters last week, in kind of a physical display of Trump's efforts to exert power over law enforcement in the US. And then we also had the Trump Organization seeking exclusive rights to use Trump's name on airports and dozens of related things like buses to umbrellas to travel bags and so on. So the trademark lawyer who uncovered those filings, Josh Gerben, called them completely unprecedented. And then 2 days later, the White House Communications Director, Steve Chung, praised the approval to rename Palm Beach International Airport after Trump, basically saying on social media that the President Donald J. Trump International Airport has a great ring to it. So unfortunately, there's kind of a lot to say on nationalism. So leaning into kind of white supremacism, Trump's nominee for a senior State Department role, this guy called Jeremy Carl, told the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in a kind of confirmation hearing that a loss of dominant white culture is weakening America. And then following a flood of donations from hard right donors in December, including Peter Thiel, Donald Trump then endorsed Texas congressional candidate Jace Yarborough on Truth Social. Now, Yarborough has recently articulated as part of his campaign in Texas a series of pretty extremist positions, including saying that immigrants don't share the same values as Americans. He called for a return to race-based immigration quotas and said that Islam is fundamentally incompatible with American citizenship. And then the administration is making it harder for immigrants here legally and those seeking legal status. So firstly, they announced a proposal to prevent undocumented immigrants from receiving federal housing assistance. Now, that may seem innocuous, but it's a policy that could displace tens of thousands of legal residents and citizens, many of them children, who live with unauthorized relatives in public housing. The Department of Homeland Security also proposed a new rule which will really make it much harder for asylum seekers to work. So basically, they said they're going to pause work permits for asylum applicants until the average processing times for those applications is less than half a year. But based on current wait times, that in itself could take over 100 years to get to that level. They've also given immigration officers much broader powers to detain legal refugees waiting a green card, basically saying they have to be re-vetted. So they've gone through this kind of very rigorous process to kind of become refugees, and then now they're applying for their green card. They're having to go through that process again. And then in January, all eyes were kind of on immigration actions in Minnesota. And then at the end of the month, the Trump administration said it was going to draw down federal immigration agents in Minnesota. But actually, it kind of now seems, according to attorneys and advocates, that what they're actually doing is kind of trying to divert people's attention, and they've moved out into the suburbs and other towns, and they're kind of using laws to get people to come out of their homes. So, for instance, in one instance, they used 2 agents who pretended that their car had broken down outside an immigrant's house who was a mechanic. He came out to help, and then agents swarmed and arrested him. So basically what people are saying is that they've kind of used that drawdown messaging to actually lower people's guards, and the arrests are continuing just as they were before with little oversight or transparency. For those who were already in ICE detention, things continue to be really grim. Last week, a detainee died in Indiana with the cause of death under investigation, making that at least the 7th death just this year in federal immigration custody. And then the Trump administration flew 9 people to Cameroon in a kind of secret deportation operation. Almost all of those 9 people had been granted protections from the US courts against being sent back to their home countries. Now, none of them were from Cameroon, but the US has not made any public deal with Cameroon to accept deportees who are from other nations. So it's all kind of quite murky and kind of going against the spirit of the rulings. And the judiciary in the US are like increasingly calling attentions to violations of the law by the immigration agency. So hundreds of judges around the US have ruled over 4,000 times since October that Trump's administration is detaining immigrants unlawfully. And yet the administration is continuing to jail people indefinitely, even after the courts ruled that that was illegal. And then kind of just to cap it off with an immigration ruling in West Virginia last week, the judge wrote the following. They said, across the interior of the United States, agents of the federal government, masked, anonymous, armed with military weapons, operating from unmarked vehicles, acting without warrants of any kind, are seizing persons for civil immigration violations and imprisoning them without any semblance of due process. It is an assault on the constitutional order. And then moving kind of away simply from thinking about immigrants, in recent months, the government has also relentlessly prosecuted protesters, government critics, and other people kind of arrested during immigration operations. And they often accuse them of physically attacking officers or interfering with the duties of those officers. But many of those cases have recently been dismissed or ended in not guilty verdicts, often because the official account of events are untrue, right? They're proven to be untrue. And criminal defense lawyers have said that it was really unusual for federal prosecutors to pursue such a high volume of charges over pretty minor clashes with law enforcement. And that it's really extraordinary then to see them also lose so many of those cases. So the assumption is that actually what's going on is an attempt to try and prevent other people from protesting and trying to having their lives upended by having to go through a legal process. So if America is aggressively pursuing immigrants at home, it is also being aggressive against other countries abroad. So firstly, and it really isn't being reported as much now, the US is continuing its military strikes on boats in international waters. In just the last week, it has destroyed 5 boats and killed at least 17 people. The US also boarded a Venezuelan-linked oil tanker in the Indian Ocean. And linked to Trump's activities in Central and South America, the US blockade of Cuba, which is the first of its kind in over 60 years, is getting closer to kind of achieving the US goal of regime change in Cuba, with the country close to collapse and suffering a humanitarian disaster. And alongside the blockade, Trump's threats of tariffs against any country assisting Cuba is working to further isolate the country. And meanwhile, across the ocean, it looks increasingly as if Trump is about to attack Iran. The BBC has confirmed the location of a US aircraft carrier, the USS Abraham Lincoln, near Iran using satellite imagery. The Abraham Lincoln leads a strike group with 3 guided missile destroyers. It carries 90 aircraft, including F-35 fighters, and almost 6,000 crew. And then Trump last week warned Iran that it had a maximum of 15 days to reach a deal with the US or bad things will happen. And then the next day, Trump said that he was considering a limited strike against Iran if it doesn't forge a deal. And the day after that, Steve Witkoff, who's the Middle East envoy, said Trump was curious as to why Iran had not yet capitulated, while also saying that Iran was a week away from industrial bomb-making material. So this is all kind of ramping up fears of an imminent major strike against Iran. And then in Munich, at the Global Security Conference, the Danish Prime Minister warned that Trump was still very serious about taking over Greenland. So I suspect that issue is going to come up again at some point over the next few months. And finally, this was also the week where Trump's International Board of Peace had its first meeting in Washington. Those who didn't come received kind of an ominous warning where basically Trump said, "You can't play cute with me." The president then suggested that his new board could overtake the United Nations. And while Gaza is supposed to be the board's primary priority and its main purpose, it wasn't discussed by Trump until 25 minutes into his welcome speech. And basically, he spent most of that speech complimenting the world leaders who were there, rating them on their good looks, talking about how rich they were and how strong they were. So moving on now to thinking about universities. So the Trump administration sued Harvard, accusing it of failing to comply with the federal investigation and seeking documents to determine whether the university had illegally considered race in its admissions process. And that comes less than 2 weeks after Trump said that his administration was seeking $1 billion from Harvard to settle the federal probes into it. And that kind of intimidation is having an effect. So it was reported that Harvard administrators had pushed a faculty committee to cancel a long-running biannual symposium featuring tenure-track women's research, basically saying they don't want to get on the wrong side of any laws around hosting a single-gender event. And then the Pentagon said that it might well stop tuition aid for top universities where Defense Secretary Hegseth considers those schools to be biased against the US military and sponsoring troublesome partnerships with foreign adversaries. And that follows on from Hegseth already targeting Harvard University in that way a few weeks ago. So now thinking about health. So staff members at the United States premier infectious disease research institute have been instructed to remove the words biodefense and pandemic preparedness from the Institute's web pages. So the US National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, called NIAID, is expected to deprioritize those two topics in an overhaul of its funded research projects. So this is directly going to weaken the US's ability to respond to new pandemic threats. Pretending it's not going to happen and removing words from a website isn't going to stop a pandemic from happening. It just makes you much less ready when it does happen. And that was reported on the same day that US Health Secretary RFK Jr. downplayed COVID risks by saying, "I'm not scared of a germ. I used to snort cocaine off of toilet seats." I mean, the levels of seriousness of this administration are just something else. Anyway, a few days later, Jay Bhattacharya, the director of the National Institutes of Health, or NIH, was then also named to be the acting director of the CDC, so the US Centers for Disease Control. And that makes him the fourth leader of the CDC in a single year. And it's also quite unprecedented because it just further consolidates power among a really small group of men at the helm of US health agencies. So Bhattacharya made a name for himself opposing measures to prevent COVID-19. And he had previously strongly criticised officials who fund research and advise on policy at the same time. But that is literally exactly what he's going to be doing now. And scientific experts are just concerned that Bhattacharya, who is a close ally of Kennedy, will also be advancing new restrictions on vaccination in his new role in the CDC. And finally, in kind of a demonstration of the further hollowing out of federal scientific agencies, the chief of the National Institute of Arthritis and Musculoskeletal and Skin Diseases, Lindsay Criswell, told her staff last week that her 5-year leadership appointment hadn't been renewed. And so that now means that 16 out of the 27 NIH institutes will be operating without a permanent director. And finally, on the environment. So at the moment, the Department of Homeland Security is shut down because Congress can't agree on its funding in the wake of the various controversies around ICE this year. But the department has really largely continued to operate because most of its functions are considered essential. However, apparently FEMA is not considered essential. Now, FEMA is the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and its mission is to help people before, during, and after natural disasters like hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, and floods. So FEMA brings in emergency personnel, supplies, and equipment to stricken areas. But last week, the Trump administration ordered FEMA to suspend deployments of hundreds of aid workers to disaster-affected areas around the country. And then also last week, incentives to promote more environmentally friendly cars are basically ending. The Environment Protection Agency, the EPA, has announced that car manufacturers will no longer earn a credit for installing engines that automatically turn off when vehicles stop and restart when drivers move again. So basically, this kind of start-stop feature is meant to both save fuel and reduce emissions. But the Trump administration has now formally rejected the science behind it, which means that they are allowed to eliminate the credit, which they have done. More generally, the administration is continuing its purge of regulations. So it announced last week that it's going to roll back air regulations limiting toxic mercury particles in the air from power plants. So a move the administration says will boost energy, but the public health groups say will harm public health for the most vulnerable groups in the US. And then for what regulations remain, the enforcement has basically ground to a halt. So it's basically reported that even if major polluters are breaking environmental laws, the Trump administration is not enforcing them, it's not prosecuting them. You can basically just get away with it. So that's kind of everything I wanted to go through this week. I'll be back next week. And then all these actions and more on TrumpActionTracker.info.